When it comes to understanding health and disease progression, both how we move towards disease, but then also how we move towards health, it's really important to understand it in terms of the idea of exponential growth or compound interest. So in the past, we could always use different economic models, different things like that to make the analogy, but we could use the term going viral, perhaps as an example that people would be able to understand a lot more commonly these days. In brief, it's the idea that growth does not simply occur in nice, straightforward patterns, and the human brain is very good at being able to detect linear patterns, straight line relationships. But when it comes to exponential growth, or the idea of things happening very slowly at first, and then suddenly all at once, we fail to understand the depth and the magnitude of how that actually works. It's as if part of our brain just simply doesn't allow us to do that. And there is a famous example. It's used by economists. I'd first heard of it from Dr. Chris Martenson, and he references the work of Dr. Albert Bartlett, who used the analogy that, okay, I have a magic water dropper. So just a simple, one little droplet. And we're going to put one droplet into your hand 1 minute at a time. And every minute, the amount of water is going to double. Why? Because it's a magic pipette. And we're going to imagine then that you are sitting in the biggest arena that you can possibly imagine. So this would be the biggest NRL ground, the Olympic Stadium, the biggest AFL ground. You get the idea. The biggest stadium that you can possibly conceive. And we'll put that magic pipette, and we're going to put it right in the middle of the grounds. And we're going to put you at the tallest, most distant point within that stadium away from that water. And we're going to handcuff you to the bleachers in the nosebleed section there. And we're just going to have you wait there until the stadium fills with water. And the question then is, okay, if you are adding one drop of water 1 minute at a time, it doubles. How long does it take before the stadium is completely full and you would find yourself drowned? Now, if you're like most people, and again, we think in terms of linearities, most people would think, okay, this is going to be something that, might take months, years to even get to that level. When it's actually just under 50 minutes. That's it. So it starts out a process very tiny, very small. But quickly and really within just 3 to 5 minutes, you have not just a single, water drop, but then you have something that is going to be about the size of a 5-cent coin. Followed a 1 cent, 2 cent, eventually a handful. And if you keep doubling it out like that, 50 minutes, that stadium, the biggest stadium that you conceive, is completely filled with water. And in addition to that, he raised the question, okay, how long would it be if, and if this is the case, it takes 50 minutes to fill up, how long would it be before the stadium is only 93% filled? In other words, you'd be looking down at the area where the sports players or where the musicians would be playing, and that little portion of it, would be submerged maybe up to their ankles or something like that. And the other 93% of the stadium is still empty. Well, how long before the 50 minutes would that be? 5 minutes. That's it. 5 minutes. So the first 45 minutes is a very slow, very gradual buildup. But suddenly, when that momentum builds and when it shifts, it happens so incredibly fast, all at once, to the point where it catches many people completely unprepared. And they look back and say, how did that happen? Everything looked like it was doing so well. It was so good. I didn't have any warning. And that's the limitation of the human brain, to be able to understand this idea of going viral or exponential growth. We don't see it unless it's basically right up in our face to the point where it's almost too late for us to do anything about it. And so we can take this and we can apply it to matters of health, matters of well-being. You see, in my line of work, which is, working with people who have had past physical injuries, is kind of the short of it. They haven't necessarily had any broken bones. They haven't necessarily had any dislocations. But they also didn't have just a little bruise or a little boo-boo either. They had some kind of an injury. And most of the time, they've completely forgotten about it. Why? Because it was so inconsequential that it didn't seem to cause any issues at all. Maybe it was a fall or an injury when they were a child. Maybe it was a quote-unquote minor fender bender. They were in the car. And for anybody who says, oh, it was just a little car accident, well, I challenge you to do this experiment. And don't literally do it, please. But what you would do is simply put this. Get somebody to tie your ankles together. Get them to tie your hands behind your back. And have them push you down and forward so that you land right on your face. That's the equivalent of 40 k's an hour. That's it. And in terms of a car, that's not really that fast at all if we think about potential, 100k an hour injuries and things like that. But simply put, imagine that. And this is the fallacy that if we perceive, we're being protected by our vehicle or by other things around us, that force will still go through you. Even if it is a relatively slow car accident, you fall straight on your face, 40 k's an hour, guess what? That's going to cause some pretty significant damage, I'd say. So you have these different kinds of injuries, one way or another, you slough them off. Or maybe you did, you went to the GP, or maybe if it was severe enough, you had a little bit of massage afterwards, or maybe even there was a paramedic on site, or you had to be admitted to the hospital and things like that, and they said, no, everything's good, you're fine, this will go away in a couple of days. Well, maybe, but maybe not. See, the perspective that they're looking for is they're already looking for the big stuff, the big problems, the broken bones, the dislocations, the lacerations, the hematomas, all of these different kinds of things. They're not looking for those signs of those very tiny kinds of issues. And this very often are the kind of things that, ultimately will go on to have a very big effect given long enough time. Why? Exponential growth, compound interest. So we could use the example of, and most people will appreciate this, you don't necessarily need big things to cause problems in the human body. So, for example, you think about a tumor, cancer. Well, it originally did start as just being a single cell. Or you think of something even like a virus. A virus is really just a piece of DNA that gets into the cell, so much, much smaller than the cell, and yet a virus, as we've discovered most recently, has the potential to bring the entire world to its knees under the right set of circumstances. So even the very tiny can have issues. And so what we're talking about then in terms of health and life, expressions and different kinds of problems like this are the kinds of injuries then that may only be 1 or 2 millimeters in size, which is going to be about the thickness of your fingernail. And you might be thinking, it's like, okay, well, Jeff, I get what you're saying. Little things can become big things, I get it. But, how does that relate to physical injuries? Well, there's a few things that you need to take into consideration here. The first bit is the sensitivity of your nerve system, your brain, your spine, and its ability to adapt to stress. Very, very sensitive. And I use this as an example here. How many of you ever gotten an eyelash caught in your eye? Or maybe a bit of sand or dust if you were down at the beach or if you were working in an industrial area. How good does that feel? Probably pretty terrible. Well, an eyelash is only about 0.15 millimeters thick. And dust particles, they are a few micrometers in diameter. The point is that even these very, very tiny things, because of the sensitivity of the nerves, can cause a lot of irritation. And so what we're talking about then, we're talking about injuries that, arguably are 10 times larger than that. So in terms of your nerve system's ability to perceive and detect that there is actually an issue, okay, we can't be so dismissive of even those tiny things as being insignificant. But then what we also have to do is we have to consider that that is a potential hole in the bucket. You see, your body and its innate wisdom is designed to be able to heal to stress, to adapt to circumstances. If it's able to heal from injuries and problems and things that we're exposed to, great, brilliant. That's exactly how it's supposed to work. We have these injuries and nothing comes about from it. Great. But then there are the other times where those injuries actually never fully get resolved. If you could imagine, you break a bone, it's going to heal whether you see an orthopedist or not. But the problem is if it heals in the wrong position, it's healed in the wrong position. And your body will now have certain limitations associated with it. And when it comes to the early onset of degenerative changes in the body, based on some, preliminary research, if you're going to look at, the biomechanics and the different things like that, it really only takes about 4 to 6 weeks before those initial molecular changes creep in there at the earliest sign of change. In other words, the physical wear and tear that can ultimately go on to affect different kinds of issues. And so, let's break it back down to the idea of compound interest. And we may use the idea of, say, like a home mortgage. And a home mortgage, let's say that we're going to pin it at a relatively low 2% rate. Not excessively high, certainly, not zero at the same breath, but, pretty darn small in the bigness of it. But then let's say that somehow or another, your banker says that, you don't actually have to pay this thing for a while. You can just let the interest accumulate for a while over a period of time. You think, it's 2%, it's not going to be that big of a deal. Well, if you actually look and if you break down the numbers, after 5 years, and we're going to do this the exact opposite way, so as opposed to thinking of it in terms of the amount of additional money that is now going to be indebted to you will be the one having to pay this back. I want you to think of this in terms of your body's resources, your body's functions. Imagine that you have a hole in the bucket and that your body's capacity, its ability to adapt, your life expression, all that sort of stuff starts draining out of that bucket at that 2% per year kind of rate. All the while, you're quote unquote feeling fine. You're not aware that there's a problem. Why? Because everything feels fine and you went and saw a few people and they said everything was okay. All right. Well, after about 5 years of a 2% drain, your body is pretty much already at 90% of its original capacity. In other words, basically 10% down. After about 10 years, you're down to about 80%. 20 years, you're down to about 70, and after 30 years, you're down to about only 55% of your original capacity. And so I want you to think about this now in terms of physical wear and tear, accumulative damage in terms of your physical body structure, in terms of your cellular metabolisms and all of this sort of stuff. You're going to have these tiny things that can add up very slowly, month by month, year by year, decade after decade, and ultimately creating these bigger kinds of issues. And very frequently, it isn't until a person has already lost about 50% of their total function that they start to express symptoms associated with these different kinds of pathological conditions or disease processes or different things like that. We've heard about the people who, they quote unquote were never sick a day in their life. And then all of a sudden they pass away or experience a heart attack. Or they were always such a model of health and then suddenly they develop cancer. This is exponential growth and compound action in practice, where people don't realize that it's these very small things that are accumulating over a long and then very sudden period of time that is actually creating the issue. And a lot of times, especially when it comes to conditions like degenerative arthritis or physical wear and tear, aches and pains, dizziness, vertigo, fatigue, all of these kinds of things, it's very frequent where people say, oh, haha, I guess, it's just what would you expect? It's because you're getting older. And I would make the very real argument that no, it has very little to do with your biological age. It has everything to do with the chronicity of a tiny condition that's actually grown up into a much bigger problem over a period of time. Now, what that rate is going to be, it's going to be different for every single person. Some conditions occur very suddenly, others occur very slowly, depending how well a person takes care of their body. And the irony is that sometimes it's the people who are the most vigilant, who do watch their exercise, who do, the right kinds of nutrition, all that sort of stuff. And guess what? They can still become sick and unwell too. None of us are immune to this. Or if you would, nobody's ever getting out of life alive. We all have a certain expiration date. We are all subject to the forces of time, gravity, and circumstantial stress, both the things that we are aware about because we consciously do them, the things of our past that we can't change as much as we sometimes wish that we could, but also the things that we are not aware of, the things that could be going on at such a tiny rate beneath the surface that they creep up on us. And then, whether it be in our 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, even our 20s, considering the amount of stress that kids are under today with all of the different tablets, devices, all of these different kinds of things, they're really not the best for us. And so you add it up over a long enough period of time, and you can really start to then appreciate how and why do these certain kinds of conditions come about into being. And this is important because a lot of times when people are going to come to me the first time and they're going to say, okay, yep, doc, I've been dealing with this for a few months, or I've been dealing with this maybe for a few years. And then when we look under the hood and we start doing a few other tests, we realize, aha, this is actually because you had an issue that you didn't even realize occurred 20, maybe even 30 years ago, and it's been doing that slow creep up. The water's been really not doing too much of anything at all. But now, here we are in the last 5 minutes, and it's coming up at us really, really quick. And so we can't go back and undo that, but what we can do is we can get on top of the condition, and thank goodness that the wisdom of the body, up until your last breath, never, ever, ever stops doing its very best it can with the resources it has to heal you, to keep you well, to do the very best that it can. It doesn't mean that things are always going to go away or that there's going to be instantaneous magic cures. No, some kinds of damage, it is quite irreparable. We have to manage, we have to do the very best that we can. But nevertheless, and I do firmly believe this, terribly important, your body and its innate wisdom never, ever stops working for you. The best thing that you can do then under the circumstances is at least have the appreciation, okay, this is how things happen in the body. These are the things that I can't change, but then these are the things that I can. And at the very least, forward going, if, where, and when, by making the right kinds of choices, and to make sure that that compound interest does not necessarily need to keep going forward, that you can actually reverse the momentum, that it may still be possible for your better days, or at least to improve your overall quality of life with whatever number of days you have forward going, can be the very best that they possibly can be.